Welcome to Living Testimonies. We're so glad that you could be with us. Our text for today comes from Psalms chapter 59, verse 16. The Bible says, "But I will sing of thy power, yea, I will sing aloud of thy mercy in the morning. For thou hast been my defense and refuge in the day of my trouble." Today we're privileged to have a guest on our show, Poole. Ryan, it's good to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
We've got an interesting story that we're going to share today. Ryan, you shared some of your story with me already. One of the things that was interesting about your story was the early part of your life. Share with us a little bit about your early Christian experience.
Well, I grew up in a very strong Christian background. I went to church primarily with my grandmother. Okay. So we were in church every week, several times a week. I was in all of the child functions. Learning as a young person, I had a lot of opportunity to spend time in the church and learn about God.
Now, growing up in church with grandmom is a little bit different.
Yes.
Because grandmom is normally kind of strict.
Yes.
How was that experience and how did that shape your life early on as far as the foundation for your Christian faith?
Yes. Well, what's interesting about that is my grandmother, she was born in 1911, so the version of Christianity that I grew up with is a lot different than what we experience today. But it was, I would say, as a foundation, it serves somewhat as an anchor because no matter how far I tried to go out there, I had that foundation to keep me in line, so to speak.
Now, as you continue to grow up, you had some changes in your home. Like most people, homes change over the years. There was a unique change in your home, particularly as it relates to your father. Share that with us a little bit.
Yes, well, my biological father left our home when I was very young. I was about 3 years old. And I grew up primarily raised with just me and my mother. When I was about 11 years old, my mother remarried. And
high school sweetheart.
Yeah, she remarried one of her high school sweethearts. And unfortunately, my stepfather was not a Christian. Okay. So we just kind of stopped going to church. Our church visitation became less and less frequent as now we had a new head of the household.
Now, you share with me, this sporadic church attendance. That has an effect on a family and on a home, particularly if you were used to something different. How did that affect your personal faith, your spiritual home, things like that?
Well, what I found, a lot of young people, they go to church and they get things shoved down their throat and they get angry and rebel, but that wasn't necessarily my experience. My experience was kind of like a coal that's taken out of the fire. I went from going to church very frequently to less and less time, and so I guess you could say I just fell out of the habit of going to church. And because I was 11 or 12 years old, I really didn't have the mindset to say, hey, something's missing, because I started experiencing different things that the world had to offer that I did not experience during the first 10 or so years of my life.
Now, in the earlier years, I remember from your testimony, in the earlier years, you were a little sheltered in the sense that grandma kept you away from certain things that you had not yet experienced.
Yes.
Going to the movies, dancing, eating chocolate.
Yes.
Share with us a few of those things and how those things changed.
Well, my mother had an interesting philosophy on life. She said she didn't want a fat child, so she would not let me eat any candy, would not, experience anything like that. But once we stopped really going to church, because my stepfather, he did not have those same principles. So those along with going to church, those same things, new things started being introduced, and those principles slowly started sliding away.
Now, as things started changing on the inside of the home, there began to be some changes on the outside of the home. You started getting involved in some different things in your neighborhood with some friends. Share with us a little bit about that experience.
Yes, soon after my mother remarried, at the time we were living in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and they closed. My stepfather worked at a Chrysler plant, and they closed his plant and moved it down to Huntsville, Alabama. I never heard of Huntsville, Alabama, so it was a big a big culture shock coming from a fairly large city to a fairly small southern town. So as we moved and transitioned down to Huntsville, Ann Arbor, as you could imagine, on the outskirts of Detroit, is a much faster life. So coming down to Huntsville, I felt kind of like I was smarter, quicker, up on all of the latest things that, would come along with growing up in a big city where people that were growing up down here were not used to.
What did you discover? Were all of your assumptions true, or did you discover some different things while you were down here?
I discovered that, first that I discovered that, there was life outside of Michigan. Growing up in Ann Arbor, everybody's a Wolverine fan, but when I came down here, the race issue really became prevalent because that was in the 80s, moving down to Huntsville, Alabama, and race tensions were really high at that time. So something that I really didn't experience in Michigan, I began to experience down here. Also the things like the civil rights movement. Those kind of things, took place a lot in Alabama. So those kind of things that I was kind of oblivious to in Michigan became very prevalent moving down to Huntsville.
Now, with all of those changes, you would expect that some of those changes would affect maybe a person's behavior because the atmosphere has changed and, your attitude might have been changing at the time.
Oh, yes. I guess you could say I almost forgot I grew up Christian because by the time we got settled down in Huntsville, I was 12, 13. As you mentioned, I started, I was introduced to the music that the world had to offer, started getting interested.
Yes, this is the change point. We're going to come back in just a few moments because we want to hear about that changing moment in your life, especially how when you came down here and things began to change for you. We'll be back in just a few moments. Welcome back to Living Testimonies. We're here with Ryan Poole, and Ryan, you were just sharing with us a little bit about your changes and some of those changes and how they affected your behavior. Share with us a little bit more about that.
Right, well, moving down to Huntsville, as I started to go to school, it became very apparent that I didn't fit in. I already didn't fit in because I had limits from my Christian background, but then I started going to public school, and so I already didn't fit in because I had a Christian background, and then being from up north, I had a different accent, a different way of dressing, and it caused a good bit of friction. So that began a long string of fighting and gang activity and just complete turnaround from what I grew up as, a young man in the church.
Now, coming down to Huntsville, coming down to the South, you probably would not have expected to get into so much trouble.
Right.
But being a child, you're going to do what children do. You got into some mischievous activities, you and a few of your friends. Share with us a little bit how those activities begin to take your life in a different direction.
Yes. Well, my stepfather had 2 children, and he had a son and a daughter. And my stepbrother was a couple of years older than me. So he used to come down every summer. And as I transitioned down here, the big city life started kind of leaving me. But when he would come down, he would refresh all of that and bring it with him. And so we really started doing some mischievous things that you could probably get away a lot easier get away with a lot easier in a bigger city. But we started, literally terrorizing our neighborhood.
Now, terrorizing Huntsville, this is a small city. You guys got involved in some grand theft auto.
Yes.
You guys were stealing some cars. How did that play out? You guys started getting into that.
Well, with any, if you hear the testimony of drug addicts, they start with something small and it grows bigger and bigger. Right. And so our mischievous behavior in the neighborhood, we got bored with that. And eventually it led to, we were out, my stepfather worked the night shift, so we would sneak out of the house at night and, just walk around the neighborhood, and after a while we would get bored, and eventually the adversary whispered in somebody's ear, hey, try this car. And we tried the car, and the door was open. The 80s, it was a much
that was
safer time, so people would leave their keys in the car, they would leave their doors unlocked, they would leave valuables. So it started out, we were just taking things from cars. And we did that for a couple of weeks, and then one time we found a car with the keys in it. Wow. Now, I was 13, I really wasn't into driving, but my brother was 15, getting ready to turn 16, so he was into driving. So needless to say, we ended up making that a new hobby, a summer hobby, taking cars from people who left their keys in the car.
So now you guys started from just taking, a few things here and there, a few items.
Change, cassette tapes and gum.
Whatever you could find that you guys thought were valuable at the time. to being really involved in just full-blown car theft, just getting out there, just jumping in the cars. If they had a key in the ignition, you guys would jump in the car and just take off and joyride for the night?
Joyride, bring the car back, by God's grace, unscathed. Didn't get any accidents, we were barely old enough to drive, but we were out, 2, 3 in the morning driving around the city. And it's interesting, the way we funded it is the change that we stole from the cars that were open, we used that for gas money. And that kind of led us to really how we almost got caught, because we were so young buying gas at 2 and 3 in the morning.
That's probably
it was
going to
kind
be
of suspicious to the attendants.
Now you guys eventually did get caught. Share with us what happened when you guys got caught up a little bit.
Well, it was 4 of us, and two of us were old enough to drive, and so eventually we got bored of it being in the same car, so we would steal a car from our neighborhood and then go to another neighborhood to see about stealing another car so that we could race.
Wow.
And what happened was we went to an apartment complex, and there's this gentleman, he had just got off work, and he left his car open, and one of our friends tried the car, and he just happened to be putting his key in the door, and he turned around and looked, and he called the police on us. So within a few minutes, the apartment complex was swarming with police, and we ended up separating and actually leaving the first car that we stole, and had to strike out on foot. And what happened from that point, I got separated from the rest of the crew, and my brother and our friends took a cab home, and I ended up having to walk. And it took me about 45 minutes to walk home from where we were, and by that time it was about 8 in the morning. My brother was and my friends, they were scared that I got caught, so they were actually getting ready to knock on the door and tell my parents what happened. And I walked in the door right before they knocked on the door, so that scared us for a moment. For a moment.
Now, that didn't last very long.
Didn't last very long. It lasted about 2 weeks, and we decided we were going to take one last car. And that's always the one last ride. We'll never do it again. And our neighbor across the street was a security guard, and so he was up at the time that we took the car. So he saw the whole thing. And
Now, was it a setup?
it was a setup.
They knew you guys were up to no good in the neighborhood. Some kids was misbehaving, so they
Right.
decided to set you guys
Right.
up. Now, on this occasion, you guys actually got caught and arrested. But fortunately for all of you, God stepped in, and you didn't get the kind of sentence that you were supposed to get.
Yes, at the time I was 13 years old. By the courts, I was considered a juvenile, and the maximum sentence was to do time in a detention center up until the age of 21.
Wow.
But God stepped in, and we only got probation. I think the probation was worse after I had to deal with my parents.
Well, almost a scare straight type moment.
Yes.
So many close calls. We'll be back in just a few moments. Welcome back to Living Testimonies. We're back with Ryan Poole, and you were sharing with us some of your personal life experiences, especially how God has just been protecting you time and time again, and so many close calls. You had several more close calls after that, particularly in your neighborhood. Share a few of those with us.
Yes. Well, after we stopped our Grand Theft Auto ring
and Fast and Furious,
right, we settled down, and I started high school at 15. But there were some young men who lived in another neighborhood who had, I guess what you could say is the precursor to a gang. It was a group of about 8 of them, and they became our rivals. I got in a fight with a few of them, and that during high school, and it was in the summer, and they started that next year. They were a few years under me, but they started that next year in high school. So from the time that I fought with them, I did not see them again until school started. So when school started, it was instantly a rekindling of that fire.
Now, and this was like 2 different gangs that had started here in Huntsville.
Well, actually, it was before the gangs started. It was a group, and the way they started, they had pledged some high school fraternities, and they didn't pass, so they created their own fraternity.
Oh, wow.
And from that fraternity that they made, they turned themselves into a gang.
Wow. Now, this was a time period that you had lost your grandmother around this time period.
Yes.
How did that impact your life, not having your grandmother and then dealing with all of these type of changes as a young person?
Right. That was a very big turning point in my life, because I went from being with her several times a week for the first 10 years of my life, and then we moved down here when I was 11, and only phone calls on birthdays and holidays, and I fell out of touch with her. And then when I turned 17, before I could rekindle that relationship, she died, and that was really devastating to me.
Now, you're trying to deal with all of that, and at the same time you're dealing with a lot of changes still as a young person, as an adolescent. There was one occasion where you actually got into an altercation with some guys and you pulled a gun on them.
Yes, that whole year, that was actually my junior year in high school. That whole year, we fought no less than 30 or 40 times throughout the year, different altercations. Right. And I had a small group. My stepbrother, had come down to live with us at this time, and so we both attended the same high school along with these other young men. And we got tired of fighting, so one of my friends, we had a group of about 8, and a couple of them owned guns. So we started carrying guns to ward off all of the fighting.
Now, that's thinking about where you've come from. It's a long way from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the days of being raised by your grandmom as a Christian. And here you are as a young man getting involved in so many different things. And your life was just changing at the time, and your grandmother at that time was no longer with you. How did you make the transition into your adult life?
Well, I joined the military, and actually by the time we started carrying guns, I had already joined the military and signed up, but I just had not left for boot camp yet. And there was a particular incident where I ended up actually pulling the gun on someone right before I left. And again, the providence of God, it was about a week before I left. I didn't shoot anybody, but maybe 2 weeks after that incident, I left and I went to boot camp. And about 2 weeks after that, one of the main young men that we were fighting he got shot and killed in a club. And I remember I was in boot camp in California, and I remember my mother writing me a long letter praising the Lord that I had joined the military and I was not in that situation anymore. And she sent me the newspaper clipping of the young man being shot and killed in Huntsville.
That must have been surreal, and I'm guessing that you must have thought for just a moment that could have been you.
Most definitely. If I did not join the military and go to California, I probably would have been in jail for shooting someone or been shot myself.
Now, you went into the military, you spent several years in the military, and since the military, God has still been blessing you. He's been protecting you. He's been keeping you. He's been your refuge in a time of trouble. Yes. You're now married. You have 4 beautiful children. Yes. You're a successful businessman here in Huntsville. Yes. Share with us a little bit about how your life has just been changed and how God has been blessing you.
Well, what's interesting about my wife is her younger brother was actually one of my fighting buddies.
Wow.
And so I knew her back when I was in high school, but we didn't really know each other, so to speak. So when I came back from the military, I wasn't a little boy anymore. So
grew up.
Right. Spending time with him, it sparked her interest, and we started talking and dating. And what's interesting, the Lord told her that she was going to marry me. And we were married in 1997. And since then, the Lord has blessed us with 4 beautiful children.
Ryan, today the Lord has even blessed you to have an awesome ministry, working with people in the community, dealing with health. I want to give you a few moments just to turn toward the camera and share with them just a little bit about how God has blessed you and brought you through and what He's doing with you today.
Yes, I believe God has a special purpose for my life in giving me the opportunity, saving me from all of the things. You know, we only scratched the surface of all of the things that I got into as a young person, but now I've lived to see my 38th year of life, and doing ministry on a full-time basis, participating in a local church with young people, and serving as a deacon, and working with Sabbath school. So the Lord has really blessed me to make a complete 180-degree turn from where I was growing up.
Wow. If ever there was a story where God has been your defense and your refuge, that story belongs to Dwyane Poole. We thank you again for coming to share with us one more time on Living Testimonies. We pray that you're blessed, and we pray that your life will continually be a living testimony.